Nina. Thanks so much for joining me today. Today I have the pleasure of sharing with you some inspiration using the new Tim Holtz STAMPtember exclusive for Simon Says Stamp. This stamp set is absolutely awesome, and it comes with this really beautiful stencil as well that's part of this collection. I'm going to be using this STAMPtember exclusive set from Tim Holtz to show you a couple different ways that you can use these products with your distress inks to create some really fun and beautiful results. Here's a close-up look of the stamp set and the stencil. You can see that the stamp set has these really great, intricate, and very detailed images. I really love that wreath, the Christmas tree, and even that plaid pattern down at the bottom is really cool because you can use it to create backgrounds or accent elements. Really great stamp set. Also, of course, there is the stencil. This stencil has two different patterns on it that could be used together or separately, which I really love because it lets you get some versatility from this particular stencil. I'm going to be using that first in this project, and we're going to be doing some watercoloring with our distress inks over top of vellum. Now this may seem like a little bit difficult to do because of course vellum is a very slick surface and non-porous, but the distress inks work wonderfully in creating a really beautiful watercolored appearance over top of the vellum, and I'll go ahead and show you how easy it is to do. Here I've got a piece of vellum. This is the Simon Says Stamp vellum. It just came out as part of the STAMPtember release, and I really love the great quality of this particular vellum. I'm going to be die cutting this with these Simon Says Stamp stitch rectangle dies. This is the largest of the stitch rectangles, and I'll go ahead and trim my vellum down so that way it can fit through my Big Shot machine with the die. So I'll go ahead and run that through. Once I've run it through my machine, I'm going to tape the vellum to my stencil, and I'm going to be using just the poinsettias for this particular card. I'm going to make sure that I get the area of the poinsettias along the bottom right-hand side so that way I can start my watercoloring. I'm going to start off by applying my distress inks with a water brush. This is a Pentel Aquash brush, but you can use any type of water brush you want. It is pretty much dry, this water brush. I do not want to have much water on this brush because the vellum is a very slick, non-porous surface. So the water is just going to end up sitting on top of the paper rather than soaking in like it would on watercolor paper or other types of papers that could handle watercoloring. Now, because of that, I want to make sure that the ink is predominant on this brush. So I don't want to have much water as I'm painting here. I'm using mostly ink. So basically the brush is just wet enough to help me pick up the ink and move it, but otherwise that's as wet as it's going to be. I'm just going to go ahead and continue adding the color over top of the stencil and getting all the poinsettias colored in for this particular pattern. I'm using Festive Berries distress ink to do my watercoloring, and I'm just again focusing on coloring in all those poinsettia petals until I have them all filled in. Then I'm going to move on with some pine needles and then color in the little holly leaves. And I really love the green of this pine needles. It really works well for this particular color scheme. If you want to go with a brighter color, I would say try maybe some mowed lawn or peeled paint. I think either of those two would look great for holly leaves, but I really wanted to go with something a little more muted, so I went with the pine needles here in this particular case. Now after I've colored in the poinsettias and the leaves, I'm going to take some gold watercolors here from Gonzai Tommy. This is a Starry Colors watercolor set. I'm sorry about my head. But what I'm doing is I'm picking up a lot of that watercolor and just dabbing that into the centers of the flowers. And I'm trying not to use too much water because again, this is that non-porous paper, so it's not going to end up soaking into the paper itself and just going to sit on top, and that'll make things a lot more splotchy. I'll remove the stencil, and then here you can see that beautiful pattern that we've got going on here. Almost looks like we hand watercolored this. It looks absolutely fabulous. I'm going to go ahead and let that dry. I did not heat set it because I want the vellum to stay nice and flat. I'm going to take my stencil, line it up on the other corner, and I'm going to start watercoloring the rest of the poinsettias. Once I finished coloring in the poinsettias, I needed to fill in some of the empty spaces with some of those holly leaves. So I'm taking my pine needles distress ink and I'm painting in my own holly leaves. And I'm trying to make them look very unperfect, kind of very loose shaped, because adding in the leaves that we did through the stencil left a very loose shape for these particular leaves. So I want to make sure that I emulate that effect and not have them look too perfect because they're going to stand out otherwise. Now I'm going to take some more of that gold watercolor and I'm going to add some dots in the background because that stencil had some dots as well, and I wanted to make sure I filled those areas in, but I didn't want to go ahead and use it through the stencil. I wanted to paint in my own. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Once I've painted those in, I'm going to go ahead and let this dry. Once we've allowed it to dry completely, I let it sit overnight because I was working on this at nighttime and I decided to come back to it later on. So this is the next morning now, and I'm taking some Delicata gold ink, and I'm pressing this along the edges of my card. You can see I mounted this vellum piece into a cream card base, and I added that Delicata ink along the edges. And now I'm going to take some gold embossing powder from Simon Says Stamp, and I'm going to dab my card base into the embossing powder. And because we have that Delicata ink along the edges of this card panel, that's going to pick up the embossing powder and hold on to it, so that way we can heat emboss it and add some nice gold edging to this card. I think it really dresses it up and adds a little bit more of a vintage feel too, which I really love with the combination of this stamp set. Now I also wanted to add a few more details to my watercolored poinsettias, so I'm going to take my Copic markers. This is an R46 color, and I'm just flicking on some shading along the areas of the petals where they're meeting the center, so they're going to be the darkest in those areas. So I'm just adding in a little bit of shading with that color. And then I'm going to bring in another red marker. This is R59, and I'm going to add a slightly darker shading towards that very center. And I really love how this really gives these flowers a little bit more of a dimensional look. I also added a tiny bit of shading to the holly leaves with a green marker, but not too much. For some embellishing, I'm going to take some Nouveau Crystal drops. This is a beautiful milky cream color. I really love this particular color of Nouveau drops. What I did was I created these Nouveau drops on some acetate, so basically a clear piece of plastic, and I let them sit for a while. I let them sit overnight, and I came back the next morning, picked them up off of the acetate, and I'm now gluing them onto my card. This is allowing me to make sure that I don't warp the vellum with the liquid of these particular Nouveau drops, because vellum is a very quick to warp paper because it's so thin and non-porous. So I'm going to go ahead and add those down with some liquid glue, and then I'll go ahead and move on to finishing up the rest of the card. To finish up this card, I added a sentiment from the new Tim Holtz stamp set. I heat embossed it onto some vellum, fussy cut it out, and popped it up onto a couple banners. The banners are created from that same cream cardstock that we used for the card base, and I also created that nice green plaid pattern by using the plaid background stamp, and I stamped it down onto some cardstock with some black ink, and then ink blended some of the pine needles color over top of it, and I created this nice tone-on-tone effect. And I really love how this card turned out. So now let's move on to our second technique, where we're going to do some emboss resist. So I'm taking a piece of Strathmore Bristol Smooth paper, and I'm going to mount this into my MISTI stamping tool. Now I'll mention that I'm mounting this into my MISTI tool without the foam pad because these are cling rubber stamps. So they don't need that extra bit of foam that the clear stamps do because they already are mounted onto that nice cushion for the rubber stamp. I'm going to prep my surface of my paper with my EK Success powder tool, and I'm going to now take my stamp and ink it up with Simon Says Stamp Clear ink. Now I'll also mention that this embossed resist pattern, I ended up changing as I went along, and I decided to end up popping this particular tree up off of my card. But I wanted to show you how this card evolved from going from the embossed resist to the end result. You could, of course, leave it as the embossed resist, but I wanted to have a little bit more dimension. So that's why you're going to see me end up changing it as I go along. But in the meantime, I'm going ahead and putting some white embossing powder over top of my stamped image and heat setting it. And now I'm taking some Festive Berries Distress ink and I'm applying a complete coat of this Distress ink over top of my paper. I'm covering every inch of this paper with that Festive Berries ink, and then that's going to give me my base coat for the coloring that I'm going to be doing here. Next, I'm going to add in some water splatters, and I'm going to start adding some texture to this paper. I'm going to cover this entire paper with the water from the Distress sprayer that I'm spritzing on top. I let it sit for about 30 seconds to a minute, and then I'll lift it up with my rag. This is a dry rag, and I just love how Distress ink reacts with the water. It's like one of those awesome things that you can't ever get enough of. I'm going to come back in with that Festive Berries Distress ink, and I'm going to start adding some darker color along the edges. I'm going to make sure that the tree ends up having a halo around it of lighter color, and it gets darker as it gets out towards the edges. So it's going to add a really nice dimensional feel to this card. As you can see, I'm going back over top of those water splatters that we did, and this is one of the things I love to do with Distress inks because it creates so much of a vibrant look. I'm going to go back in with that water, add more texture, and I'm going to continue doing this until I have multiple layers of water and texture added to this card because it really adds a lot of dimension and really cool effects to your card design. For my last color, I'm going to take some Fired Brick Red. I really love this deep dark red color, and I'm going to be using this very sparingly so that way I don't overpower the lighter red with the darker red. I want to make sure that I maintain that nice highlight that we have in the center and then the gradual coloring that we have towards the edges. I'm going to add in some more water splatters, make sure I get those added in, and I'll go ahead and lift those off with my rag just like I did for all the other layers. And then it's time to go ahead and work on adding some extra detail to this panel. I'm going to take the other side of that beautiful stencil. These distressed flecks on that left-hand side of the stencil really remind me of snow. And I thought it would look really cool if I took some delicata silver ink and added that along the edges. So what I'm doing is I'm making sure I cover up all the edges of the paper with this delicata ink through the stencil, and it's allowing me to create this really beautiful flecked pattern in the background. Once I've got that completely covered, you can see the beautiful results and the added shimmer that we have from putting that ink along the edges. Really, really fabulous. Now here's where I'm going to go ahead and change up my card design by stamping this onto some vellum. This is that Simon Says Stamp Vellum. I'm going to heat emboss it with some white embossing powder just like I did for the original piece. And I'll go ahead and heat set that and then cut it out with my fine tip scissors. I'm just going to go around all the edges of this particular piece, making sure that I leave a little bit of a border, almost as if I die cut it. I really love doing this for a lot of my stamped images because it adds a lot of dimension and also makes them look like they've been die cut. I'm going to take some Cool Tack foam tape now and add this to the back side of my tree. I'm making sure to hide the adhesive behind the letters on this particular image because that's going to help disguise the fact that we have the tape back there even more. This tape is clear, so it's really hard to see anyway, but when you hide it behind the words, it's almost literally invisible. So sorry about my head, I'm trying to line this up over top of my stamped image, but once I have it lined up, I'll go ahead and press that down good, and you can see that great dimension that we have now from adding that up onto some foam tape. I really love the effect, but again, that embossed resist that we did with the tree and having it flat onto the card would have made a really great card to easily mail, and it also looked just as cool. But either way works, and you can definitely do whatever one you like best. I'm going to now pop this particular panel up onto my card base. This is a white A2 card, and I'm going to use some fun foam to go ahead and pop this up. So I'll just go ahead and add this to the back side, and then I'll glue it down to my card. Now I also want to create some Nouveau crystal drops to put onto the background of my card. And the reason I'm doing it onto some acetate is because distress inks react with the Nouveau crystal drops because they're a liquid material. So if I had applied this over top of my distress ink background, it would have turned the Nouveau drops a different color. So it would have had a pinkish look and not that true white. And I did not want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a ton of these crystal drops onto this acetate, and that's going to then allow me to glue them onto my panel and not have to worry about them changing color. So here you can see I'm starting to add them onto my paper. I'm just popping them up off of the acetate. This is the next day because of course I needed to let them dry overnight. You can see they're nice, perfect round shape, and they have a little bit of dimension. And I really love how it allows you to create your own custom enamel dots in so many different sizes and in all the colors that you want. So you could buy Nouveau crystal drops in any color. There's tons of different ones to choose from. And you can create your own in the colors that you like. So you don't have to worry about buying a pack of enamel dots and not using some of them because you don't like the color or you didn't have enough of one color. This allows you to create your own custom set. So I'll just glue those down with some liquid adhesive, and then I just finished off this card by adding a silver bow to the top using some bow wire, and that finished off this card. I love how fun this stamp set is from Tim Holtz for Simon Says STAMPtember event. It's really, really fabulous, and again, remember that this is a limited time only stamp set, so once it's sold out, it won't be coming back, so make sure you grab yours now while they're still available. I'll have a link to those in the video description below and also on the blog post. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below and head on over to the Simon Says Stamp blog where you can get more information on STAMPtember, the Tim Holtz stamp set, and lots more. Be sure to give this video a big thumbs up, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can connect with us on social media at Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, YouTube, as well as our blog. Thanks so much for watching. I will see you again soon.